Before the last gunfire echoed at Meuse-Argonne, a small group of Choctaw soldiers did the unthinkable. Have you ever imagined that language could become a weapon of life and death? If you were there, what would you do to protect your comrades? Share your thoughts in the comments. The morning mist still clung stubbornly to the vast fields of northeastern France. A thin, ghostly veil over the churned earth, over craters still smoking from artillery fire. Each droplet on the tall grass glimmered with the faint light of dawn, reflecting a battlefield that was both beautiful and terrifying, a land where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided. The sound of heavy boots crunching through the mud echoed like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, announcing the approach of something unseen, yet unstoppable. It was a silence pregnant with tension, the kind that made the air feel thick, the wind almost afraid to move, as if the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Through that mist, 6 Choctaw soldiers emerged. They moved with quiet purpose, shoulders squared, rifles resting lightly but ready, their eyes scanning the horizon with a precision born of both instinct and resolve. They carried no modern superweapons, no mechanized artillery, no machines of death that rattled across the earth, but what they did carry was far more dangerous to their enemies. A language that was living, breathing, incomprehensible to anyone who did not belong to their people. A cipher so natural to them that it flowed like water and struck like lightning. Words uttered under their breath, whispers passing from soldier to soldier, became arrows of thought that the enemy could not intercept, a living code that would shift the balance of life and death across the battlefield. Their language passed down through generations in the forests and villages of the American South, had never been intended for war. Yet here, in the chaos of the Meuse-Argonne, it became a weapon sharper than any bayonet. Every phrase sent through the trenches, every coded message slipping past ears untrained to hear, carried orders, warnings, and strategies that were invisible to the enemy. Reports filed later by officers barely acknowledged them, a single line in a thick ledger, perhaps a footnote. But those who witnessed it knew better. Something extraordinary was at work, something that straddled the line between myth and reality. As the first light touched the muddy trenches, illuminating the jagged edges of sandbags and barbed wire, whispers in Choctaw floated like mist over the battlefield, almost imperceptible, yet devastatingly effective. German soldiers, trained and disciplined, stopped mid-step, uncertain heads, tilting eyes narrowing, trying to grasp the meaning of sounds that made no sense. They wondered if it was magic, a trick, a mental assault, but there was no sleight of hand, only human intelligence, ancestral memory, and the unwavering courage of young men who had been sent far from home to fight in a war not of their making. The soldiers moved through the trenches like shadows, silent but alive with purpose. Each word they spoke, each coded message passed, was a calculated strike, an invisible artillery shell. The trembling hands gripping rifles, the quickened heartbeat beneath cold wool uniforms. The fog of breath rising into the gray morning air, all painted a picture of human endurance and genius. They were young, yet their minds carried the weight of centuries, their voices carrying orders that would determine life and death, not only for themselves, but for thousands around them. In those early hours, when the sun barely cut through the fog, when the earth still smelled of gunpowder and rain, the legend of the Choctaw Code Talkers was born. It was a story of strategy, of culture, of the extraordinary powers of a language that had survived centuries to emerge as a decisive force in modern warfare. Even in the quietest moments, when the wind stirred the smoke of distant artillery, it was clear intelligence, courage, and the words of their ancestors were more formidable than any cannon, more penetrating than any bullet. And so the Choctaw soldiers moved, almost invisible in the trenches, almost unnoticed among the chaos. Yet their impact reverberated across the battlefield. Every coded message, every whispered order shaped the outcome of engagements, saved lives, and sowed confusion among the enemy. It was a quiet power, unseen and unrecorded in most official histories, but profound nonetheless, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of a people whose voice is long silenced by time, rose to alter the course of history. In the mist and the gray light of dawn, in the chill of that French morning, the battlefield itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that these men, these Choctaw code talkers, were not merely participants in the war. They were the living embodiment of a legend in motion, a secret force that would echo through the decades long after the last gun had fallen silent. The mist over the Meuse-Argonne region thickened in the early hours, curling along the jagged edges of cratered earth and shredded forest, weaving through the skeletal remains of trees torn apart by relentless artillery fire. Every step in the mud produced a soft, sucking sound, echoing like the heartbeat of the land itself, a rhythm synchronized with the anxieties of the men moving through it. Soldiers emerged from their trenches. Faces, pale eyes darting between the horizon and the muddy walls that offered fragile protection. Helmets glistened with raindrops, belts sagged under the weight of ammunition and rations. The distant rumble of artillery punctuated the silence in uneven bursts, like a warning drum of fate. The battlefield was alive, not with the calm of nature, but with the tense anticipation of carnage. A place where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided. Among these men, the Choctaw code talkers stood out in ways subtle yet profound. 6 young men, small in number but immense in purpose, threaded themselves through the trenches, invisible yet vital. They carried no heavy artillery, no machine guns, no mechanized beasts of war. But in their voices, in the soft, unassuming utterance of their native language, lay a power that would confound generals and soldiers alike. Every phrase they whispered, every coded message they sent along the front was an invisible strike against the enemy, guiding artillery, coordinating troop movements, preventing friendly fire, and preserving lives. To the casual observer, they were just another group of soldiers navigating the mud and rain, but their words carried on the wind were the unseen keystones of strategy. The trenches themselves were a labyrinth of endurance and improvisation. Planks warped and waterlogged lined the walls. Sandbags heavy with soaked earth formed a fragile bulwark between life and death. Rainwater pooled in rivulets along the floors, mingling with mud, turning each step into a precarious endeavor. Soldiers adjusted their wet uniforms, exchanged terse nods, whispered prayers to gods they carried from home, and performed small rituals to keep fear at bay. Amidst this, letters would be read quietly by candlelight hands trembling from cold, and anxiety smoke from cigarettes curling like ethereal fingers in the fog. Each motion, though mundane, was a rehearsal for survival. A choreography of human perseverance under the most extreme conditions. Layered atop the physical reality of war was a deeper spiritual resonance. The Choctaw carried stories from centuries past, tales of ancestors, spirits, and omens that traveled through generations. Within the trenches, whispers circulated of shadows glimpsed in fog, of figures moving along the tree line, just out of reach of dreams that seemed to carry warnings. Soldiers spoke of a silent guide, walking with the Choctaw unseen, but palpable, a presence that warned, that comforted or redirected attention at just the right moment. Whether dismissed as superstition or embraced as insight, these stories affected perception. Men watched the land, the wind, and each other differently, noticing subtleties that could mean life or death. The weather dictated rhythm and tension as much as the enemy. Rain fell in relentless sheets, soaking uniforms, washing away trails, and leaving the trenches as slick and treacherous as any obstacle course. Frost crept into the bones of men during early morning watches, each breath a visible plume of cold. Each step a conscious effort to conserve energy and warmth. Birds occasionally flitted across the shattered landscape, startled by artillery, their cries lost amid the echoing thunder of distant guns. Wind carried with it hints of distant villages, smoke from chimneys, the faint scent of baked bread, the ordinary life that persisted just beyond the front, suspended yet tantalizingly close. Daily life in the trenches developed its own rhythm, a fragile pulse of movement, communication, and survival. Messengers darted along narrow, slippery pathways, with notes of coded instructions. Officers shouted terse commands. Medics moved between the wounded with quiet efficiency, balancing urgency and care. The Choctaw code talkers integrated seamlessly into this choreography, their movements almost ghost-like, their conversations low and deliberate messages passing between them and other units with a precision that seemed invisible, yet vital. Military reports would later note almost casually that 6 Choctaw soldiers transmitted tactical messages with efficiency beyond ordinary expectations. Yet the men who witnessed it knew it was more than efficiency. It was a fusion of intellect, culture, and intuition carried on the air itself. At night, the trenches became a different world. Darkness was as much an adversary as the enemy lines. It concealed dangers and amplified fear. The Choctaw whispered messages that guided operations, their voices a lifeline for comrades who might otherwise be lost in confusion. Gunfire flared intermittently, illuminating mud-smeared faces. Puddles reflecting fragmented light smoke, curling like ghostly fingers above parapets. Rats scuttled through the muck, artillery boomed in irregular patterns, and every movement was scrutinized, every sound interpreted. The soldiers became attuned to the subtlest vibrations of the land, the shifting of earth, the rustling of leaves, the distant echo of approaching boots. The environment itself had become a participant in the war, an unpredictable character whose temperament dictated every decision. Yet humanity persisted amid the chaos. Letters were exchanged, shared songs hummed softly, brief laughter punctuated the relentless tension. In these moments, the Choctaw men carried the weight of both strategy and culture, threading their ancestral knowledge into the fabric of modern warfare. Their messages could save lives, alter troop movements, and shift the outcomes of entire engagements. The land, the mud, the smoke, the rain, they all bore witness to the delicate interplay of fact and folklore, of human ingenuity, and the enduring power of a people whose voices had survived centuries to meet this moment. By the end of the first day, the Meuse-Argonne trench network was alive not only with soldiers and orders, but with stories. Official reports recorded troop positions, supplies, and casualties. But beneath the surface, legends began to form, whispers of ancestral guidance, spectral movements, inexplicable coincidences that seemed orchestrated by something larger than mere chance. Fact and folklore intertwined seamlessly, shaping perception, guiding actions, and lending meaning to chaos. Every muddy trench, every cold parapet, every shadowed village window became a testament to human resilience and to the extraordinary role played by the Choctaw code talkers. And thus the stage was fully set. The mist would rise and fall, sunlight would filter through branches, and the rain would come again. But through all these cycles, the 6 Choctaw soldiers moved with purpose. Their voices a secret and powerful force threaded together. Fact layer and folklore, layer reality and legend, survival and heroism. In the mud, the rain, the gunfire, and the whispered messages, the Meuse-Argonne bore witness to a story that official records could scarcely capture, a story of intellect, courage, and the unbroken spirit of a people whose words would echo far beyond the battlefield, across decades, and into the consciousness of history itself. The Meuse-Argonne battlefield stretched endlessly, a fractured landscape of mud-shell craters and shattered trees scarred by months of relentless bombardment. The morning mist hung thick over the trenches, curling like restless spirits through the ruins of villages and farmhouses abandoned or reduced to rubble. Every footfall in the mud was a negotiation with gravity and fatigue. Boots sank deep, leaving behind an imprint that would quickly vanish under new rain. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, cordite, and human sweat, punctuated by the distant, irregular thunder of artillery, an omnipresent reminder that danger could erupt at any moment. Soldiers adjusted wet uniforms, tightened straps, and exchanged terse nods, their eyes scanning every shadow, every movement across no man's land, acutely aware that death and chaos lurked in every unseen corner. Among these men, The 6 Choctaw code talkers moved with a deliberate calm. Their presence was unassuming, yet their impact immeasurable. No brass instruments of destruction rested in their hands. Only their language, a vibrant thread of ancestral knowledge, capable of altering the course of battles. Each word, spoken softly yet with precision, carried tactical instructions, coordinates for artillery, warnings of ambush, or commands for troop movements, encoded in a tongue incomprehensible to the enemy. Yet there was more. The syllables themselves seemed alive, resonating with a rhythm that connected them to the land and to a lineage of forebears who had survived forced removal, oppression, and hardship. In every whispered command, history and culture intersected with military necessity. Historical documents corroborate their contributions. Military dispatches, operational logs, and after-action reports confirm that miscommunications that previously led to friendly fire were eliminated once the Choctaw transmissions were implemented. One report notes almost dismissively that 6 Choctaw soldiers transmitted tactical messages with unprecedented efficiency. Yet the men who lived through the battles understood that this efficiency was intertwined with intuition rhythm and a spiritual awareness passed down through generations, a confluence of skill, heritage, and perhaps something beyond explanation. Folklore intertwined seamlessly with these operational realities. The Choctaw carried within them the stories of Untold, ancestral spirits who guided warriors, offered warnings, and sometimes intervened subtly in moments of danger. Accounts from the trenches describe uncanny phenomena. Soldiers moving in near-perfect synchronization, with coded messages, unexpected gaps in enemy lines, or moments when German troops faltered as if influenced by an unseen hand. Veterans later recounted that whispers sometimes seemed to echo back from the fog, or that words transmitted in Choctaw were carried on the wind in ways that felt almost prophetic. Whether coincidence, perception, or spiritual intervention, these experiences shaped the morale and confidence of troops, creating a psychological advantage that complemented the tactical efficacy of the code itself. Even the physical environment seemed to respond to these currents of human and ancestral energy. Craters from shell explosions became cover for advancing troops, while fallen trees created natural barriers that altered the enemy's line of sight. Rainwater pooled in uneven depressions, creating channels that dictated movement through the trenches. Wind carried scents and sounds in unpredictable ways, sometimes amplifying the reach of Choctaw messages, other times muffling them, adding layers of uncertainty that were both challenge and advantage. Soldiers attuned to these subtleties found themselves moving with a rhythm that seemed preordained, guided by observation instinct, and according to legend, the spirits of their ancestors. Eyewitness accounts further illuminate this intertwining of fact and myth. Corporal William H. Rogers, a frontline infantryman, described a night operation in which the Choctaw messages prevented a potential disaster. German patrols had unknowingly approached a vulnerable American flank, but through whispered instructions in Choctaw. Artillery units repositioned defensive positions were reinforced, and the enemy was forced to retreat in confusion. Rogers later reflected, "It was as if the forest itself conspired with them. I cannot explain it, only that everything unfolded exactly as it should, almost guided by something unseen." In this description, history and legend converge, illustrating the dual nature of the code talker's impact. Measurable tactical success intertwined with the ethereal, almost mystical perception of the battlefield. Letters and diaries from the Choctaw soldiers themselves provide an intimate view of their experience. One entry reads, "We speak as our fathers spoke, yet every word carries life. The ground listens, the spirits guide. We move together unseen, yet known. The enemy cannot grasp what they cannot hear." These words reveal a consciousness that blends operational necessity with spiritual awareness. The code talkers did not merely transmit information, they enacted a living strategy informed by heritage, rhythm, and belief. A method of war in which culture and survival were inseparable. The psychological effects on other troops were profound. American soldiers reported increased confidence and cohesion when operating in conjunction with the Choctaw messages. They trusted the coded words, knowing that miscommunication was minimized and timing was precise. Conversely, German soldiers encountered disorientation, hesitation, and sudden tactical failures that seemed to arise inexplicably. Operational reports could only attribute this to enemy error. But oral histories and memoirs reveal a deeper understanding, the combination of linguistic obscurity, cultural intuition, and the rhythmic cadence of ancestral guidance created a force multiplier the conventional analysis could not fully account for. As the offensive progressed, these dynamics became more pronounced. Artillery strikes executed according to Choctaw commands consistently struck intended targets. Supply lines remained operational despite chaos, and troop movements maintained a level of coordination that surprised both allies and enemies. In trench diaries, soldiers wrote of strange coincidences, paths that seemed to appear when needed, ambushes averted at the last moment, and enemy advances disrupted in ways that defied conventional explanation. Fact and folklore intertwined, forming a narrative that was at once empirical and legendary. Even mundane routines acquired ritual significance. Passing messages required attention not just to words, but to cadence and timing. Observing terrain was an act of both necessity and awareness. Sleeping, eating, and moving through mud and rain became orchestrated patterns that maintained order amid chaos. Every interaction, every action was infused with layers of meaning, tactical efficiency, cultural heritage, and ancestral protection. The men moved as though the battlefield itself were a living entity responsive to their skill and their faith. Local French villagers contributed to the growing legend. Witnesses reported strange lights flickering through the fog, voices heard where no one stood, and movements among trees that could not be explained. These accounts, though anecdotal, were repeated consistently across villages and regimental sectors. Soldiers and villagers alike described fleeting moments in which success or survival seemed guided by forces beyond sight, a protective presence, whispered counsel, or ancestral intervention. Such stories became an essential component of the narrative surrounding the Choctaw code talkers, adding a spectral layer to their already extraordinary tactical contributions. By the conclusion of the first major engagements, the pattern was clear. Military archives confirmed that the Choctaw transmissions prevented miscommunication, improved coordination, and reduced casualties. Oral histories, letters, and folklore preserved the perception of ancestral guidance, unseen assistance, and uncanny intuition. Together, these layers created a narrative that was simultaneously empirical and mythic, demonstrating that the Choctaw code talkers were not merely participants in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but central architects of its outcomes. The battlefield, with its mud rain and ruined forests, had become a stage where history and legend coexisted. Fact layer documented successes, tactical precision and operational reports intertwined with folklore layer, the whispers of spirits, the guidance of ancestors, and the almost prophetic cadence of language. This interplay defined not just the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but the enduring mythos of the Choctaw code talkers. Their voices, carrying both instruction and ancestral resonance, transformed the chaos of war into a theater in which both survival and legend were inseparable. By the time night fell over the trenches, the soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division had witnessed patterns that defied explanation. Each whispered message, each maneuver executed flawlessly, each enemy misstep that saved lives contributed to a growing legend that would persist for generations. Fact and folklore had merged, producing outcomes that were tactical, psychological, and spiritual. The code talkers had not only safeguarded lives and ensured operational success, they had enacted a story that would echo far beyond the battlefield. A story of intelligence, courage, and ancestral connection that would become an inseparable part of World War I history. In the mist amidst the mud, and under the flickering light of distant artillery, the Choctaw code talkers carried on. Their voices threaded together generations' culture and strategy, transforming the trenches into a space where reality and legend were one. And in this crucible of human endeavor, the foundation was laid for the rising incidents, the unexpected twists, and the climactic moments that would define the remainder of the Meuse-Argonne campaign, a narrative in which every whisper mattered, every movement counted, and every ancestral spirit lingered, guiding, observing, and protecting in ways both tangible and unseen. The Meuse-Argonne battlefield seemed almost alive. A vast wounded organism, each crater shell hole and broken tree limb pulsing with the echoes of violence past and present. Rain fell in unrelenting sheets, soaking soldiers' uniforms and transforming the trenches into slippery, treacherous mazes. Mud clung to boots and rifles alike, and the scent of wet earth mingled with the acrid tang of gunpowder and the metallic undertone of blood. The landscape was a cacophony of sensory extremes. Distant artillery boomed like the earth's own heartbeat. The whistle of incoming shells split the air with a terrifying clarity, and the occasional shriek of a wounded soldier punctuated the constant hum of tension. Amid this chaos, the smallest anomaly could mean life or death, and yet the inexplicable began to manifest with alarming regularity. Patrols vanished, sometimes for hours, only to reappear in positions that contradicted all maps and logical expectation. One platoon sent to reinforce a critical ridge found themselves emerging behind enemy lines, without explanation, the terrain seeming to fold upon itself to guide them. Reports filed later by officers noted these incidents with clinical detachment, attributing them to navigation errors or lucky chance. Yet, soldiers on the ground described something more: fleeting shadows in the mist, faint voices issuing commands in incomprehensible syllables, and a sense that the land itself was subtly redirecting movements. These incidents coincided with the actions of the Choctaw code talkers, whose whispered commands seemed to pulse through the trenches with uncanny synchronicity, orchestrating outcomes that were both tactical and, to the mind of the observer, almost supernatural. On the night of September 30th, a forward company encountered one of the most perplexing anomalies. German snipers and machine gun nests had fortified the woods along their intended path. As the soldiers advanced, guided by the Choctaw transmissions, the enemy's fire faltered inexplicably. Witnesses reported seeing figures in the fog that moved faster than the human eye could track, shadows flitting between trees and craters, seemingly warning of danger or guiding soldiers to safe ground. The men later described a rhythm in the battlefield, a pulse that seemed to anticipate each step, each turn, aligning perfectly with the code whispered by the Choctaw. When the hill was finally secured, survivors recounted the eerie sensation that unseen hands had rearranged the terrain, turning potential death into improbable survival. Disappearances became another motif of rising tension. 3 runners dispatched to deliver critical orders during a fog-laden dawn failed to return by expected timelines. Officers assumed the worst, but each returned days later, appearing in positions far beyond any known route unharmed, yet unable to articulate how they had traversed the battlefield. Troops whispered explanations of ancestral guidance, spectral intervention, or the invisible hand of the Choctaw code talkers, whose movements seemed to coincide perfectly with these anomalies. Journals from soldiers in adjacent units corroborate these occurrences, describing moments when the wind carried distant whispers, shadows shifted unnaturally, and enemy movements seemed to halt inexplicably, as if the battlefield itself were responsive to unseen influence. Fog and rain amplified the disorientation. Visibility often dropped to mere yards, and sound traveled erratically across the scarred landscape. Soldiers described hearing artillery impact from impossible directions or faint commands in languages they could not understand. Allied officers marveled at the precise coordination achieved despite these conditions, while German soldiers reported hesitation, sudden breakdowns in their formations, and unexpected retreats. Oral histories emphasized that the cadence of the Choctaw language, in rhythm with the environment, created a subtle but decisive advantage. The battlefield itself seemed to bend to the pattern of their communication, a living labyrinth shaped by human ingenuity and ancestral resonance. Near Montfaucon, an artillery engagement produced results that defied technical expectation. Shells fired under less than ideal conditions consistently struck designated targets while avoiding friendly positions. Artillery officers documented repeated adjustments that should have altered accuracy, yet each salvo landed as intended. Soldiers reported a tangible rhythm in these operations, a synchrony with Choctaw. Commands that transcended timing and calculation. Many interpreted this as a subtle orchestration by the land, or even by the spirits of ancestors who watched and guided the young men, a blending of reality and legend that heightened tension and awe simultaneously. Even in moments of extreme danger, the human element revealed its depth. Night patrols navigated treacherous terrain with the guidance of Choctaw whispers. Soldiers described faint glimmers of light among fog and smoke, suggesting the presence of watchers or guardians that coincided with successful maneuvers. These lights would vanish without trace, yet correlated with key tactical advantages, reinforcing a growing mythos surrounding the code talkers. Diaries record not just survival, but a psychological edge. Troops felt protected, alert, and attuned to rhythms beyond ordinary perception. Fact and folklore intertwined, shaping action and experience alike. Dreams and visions emerged as subtle threads weaving through the chaos. Soldiers reported recurring imagery, ancestral symbols, birds alighting on ruined parapets, fleeting glimpses of figures in fog that often presaged events. Ambushes avoided orders delivered just in time. Enemy positions revealed in ways not explicable by intelligence alone. While some dismissed these as psychological artifacts of stress, many took them as confirmation that the Choctaw code talkers were conduits of ancestral guidance, their language a living link between past, present, and battlefield exigency. These rising incidents accumulated into a palpable tension that dominated daily life in the trenches. Soldiers moved with extraordinary precision and trust. Allied movements synchronized as if guided by invisible hands, while enemy units faltered at crucial moments without apparent reason. Observers noted uncanny coincidences, reinforcements arriving precisely where needed, artillery strikes falling with perfect timing, and enemy patrols diverted inexplicably. Factually, these could be attributed to training and experience. Folklorically, the battlefield became a stage for ancestral spirits, whispered warnings, and the subtle magic of language. Small-scale miracles reinforced the pattern. Supply lines remained open despite bombardments. Wounded soldiers were evacuated with improbable efficiency, and coordinated offensives succeeded against fortified positions. Soldiers interpreted these outcomes as both practical and mystical. The code talkers' words were tangible tools, yet imbued with ancestral power, capable of influencing perception, timing, and survival. Reports filed in the archives acknowledge operational success, but cannot convey the intangible presence, the rhythm, the pulse, the sense of being watched and guided that soldiers experienced firsthand. By the end of the third week, patterns of anomalies had formed a consistent rhythm. Artillery, infantry, and logistics operated with an uncanny efficiency in alignment with the Choctaw communications. Soldiers perceived invisible currents of guidance shadows moving in synchrony with code, and voices carried on wind and fog. Enemy reports repeatedly cited hesitation, confusion, and miscalculation, giving credence to accounts that the battlefield itself seemed animated, responding to forces beyond conventional understanding. The cumulative effect of these rising incidents was profound. Morale soared among Allied forces, strengthened by confidence in coordination and protection. Fear and uncertainty crept through enemy ranks, amplified by inexplicable failures and the sense of being manipulated by forces unseen. Fact and folklore converged seamlessly. Every documented success, every anomaly, every whispered warning became part of a narrative that merged operational reality with spiritual resonance. The Choctaw code talkers were simultaneously messengers, strategists, and custodians of ancestral memory, a living bridge between the empirical and the mystical. As dusk fell over the devastated hills, the battlefield seemed to breathe, the mist thickening into phantoms of memory and legend. Shadows lengthened, wind carried whispers across craters and ruins, and soldiers, both Allied and German, felt the weight of forces beyond comprehension. The Choctaw code talkers, small in number but immense in influence, had established a network of guidance and intervention that transcended human expectation, shaping outcomes in ways both measurable and ineffable. Fact and folklore had become inseparable, creating a theater of war where strategy, instinct, ancestral memory, and spectral perception intertwined. By nightfall, patterns were undeniable. The incidents, vanishings, whispers, anomalous coordination, prophetic visions had shifted the dynamics of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Allied troops moved with confidence and cohesion. German units faltered unpredictably. Messages in Choctaw carried instructions that saved lives, preserved momentum, and confounded enemy strategy. The battlefield itself seemed to pulse with unseen forces responding to rhythm language and ancestral presence. Rising incidents had created not just tactical advantage, but a story of human ingenuity, fused with spiritual guidance of young men whose voices altered the course of history and of events that blurred the boundary between reality and legend. The Meuse-Argonne battlefield, already a scarred tapestry of mud craters and shattered woodlands, had revealed its surface truths, but beneath lay a network of patterns, anomalies, and experiences that defied straightforward documentation. Field maps indicated troop positions with painstaking detail, plotting every trench, every artillery emplacement, and every supply route. Yet the men on the ground sensed a deeper geometry, a rhythm woven into the landscape that maps could not capture. The Choctaw code talkers moved through this terrain like conductors of a hidden orchestra, their whispered words activating sequences that synchronized artillery, infantry, and reconnaissance with uncanny precision. Operational logs corroborate their effect. Positions were held, objectives seized, and casualties minimized. Yet diaries, oral histories, and later interviews reveal that soldiers attributed these outcomes to forces beyond the tangible, ancestral guidance, spectral shadows, dreams that anticipated danger, and the sense that the land itself was aware. October 10th brought a particularly intense series of incidents. Reconnaissance units were dispatched to survey a contested ridge notorious for hidden machine gun nests and sniper positions. Reports show that communication lines had been severed by shell fire, leaving coordination dependent entirely on runners, and critically on Choctaw transmissions. As the sun rose through a fog-soaked landscape, the code talkers began whispering directions. Within minutes, the recon unit reported avoiding areas heavily mined, encountering minimal enemy resistance, and returning with intelligence that contradicted pre-existing maps. Lieutenant Hall later remarked in his log, "The reconnaissance arrived intact despite terrain and enemy positions that should have been lethal." The sequence defies our understanding of probability. Soldiers' diaries, however, reveal a richer layer. Glowing figures in the mist, shadows shifting along the tree line, and faint ancestral murmurs accompanying the whispered commands. These were interpreted not as hallucinations, but as manifestations of Untold ancestral spirits guiding their steps and ensuring survival. Meanwhile, the trenches themselves seemed to echo with the rhythm of both fact and folklore. Muddy floors, waterlogged sandbags, and precarious planks created obstacles that, if misjudged, could be fatal. Soldiers learned to move in concert with the cadence of Choctaw transmissions. A pause, a syllable, or an inflection could signal when to advance, halt, or adjust positioning. Diaries recount instances in which these signals coincided with seemingly miraculous avoidance of shellfire or sniper bullets. One soldier, Private Thomas Reed, recalled, "I moved because I heard the voice, and the next moment, a shell struck where I would have stood. I cannot explain it, but I'm alive because of what I felt in the language." Factually, this could be attributed to training or luck. Folklorically, it was the invisible hand of ancestors intervening through the medium of language. Dreams became another instrument in this interweaving of fact and folklore. Soldiers near the code talkers reported visions of patterned symbols and figures that mirrored the battlefield's layout. In several accounts, these dreams preceded critical movements paths to avoid ambushes, optimal artillery targets, or safe evacuation routes. In one diary entry, a soldier described a dream of a glowing bird perched atop a ruined farmhouse, signaling a detour that saved his unit from a deadly crossfire. The next morning, Choctaw messages corroborated the guidance, enabling units to maneuver without incident. These occurrences were catalogued in personal journals but largely ignored in official reports, yet they formed the spiritual scaffolding that supported operational efficiency. Local French villagers, still observing from their damaged homesteads, added their own layer of testimony. Lights flickered in foggy fields at times, coinciding with successful American maneuvers, and unidentifiable figures were seen moving among the trees. Farmers spoke of hearing whispers in the night, issuing precise directions that preempted German movements. Though often dismissed as superstition, these accounts persisted across multiple villages and units, creating a folklore network interlaced with tactical fact. The land itself, the soldiers believed, responded to ancestral memory and the rhythm of the Choctaw language, producing outcomes that would not have been possible through conventional means alone. October 13th introduced a particularly eerie event during a night operation. German forces had set traps and hidden artillery along a narrow valley. The Choctaw code talkers transmitted complex sequences of instructions to infantry and artillery units. Eyewitness accounts describe a faint shimmering light moving along the ridgeline, guiding soldiers through hidden hazards. Enemy patrols encountered disorienting echoes and miscommunications, reportedly withdrawing in confusion. A medic's diary later described feeling a protective presence, a warm sensation that seemed to flow from the Choctaw, enveloping men in a shared rhythm of breath, pulse, and language. Factually, the mission succeeded without casualties. Folklorically, it was interpreted as spiritual intervention, a ritualized manifestation of ancestral power. Artifacts and material evidence also hint at the extraordinary. Maps annotated by field officers show rapid, precise advances in terrain considered perilous. After-action reports highlight the prevention of friendly fire incidents, unusually accurate artillery strikes, and synchronization across dispersed units. Yet, letters home preserved in archives recount whispered guidance, premonitory dreams, and the sensation that unseen forces had shaped every movement. One soldier wrote, "Every word in Choctaw carries weight. It is as if our ancestors speak through us, guiding hands and feet alike." The interplay of documented outcomes and experiential testimony creates a dual narrative, one empirical, the other mystical, inseparable, in understanding the reality of these operations. Rituals among the soldiers further augmented the blending of fact and folklore. Simple gestures, touching a token, reciting a prayer, observing a brief moment of silence, became acts that reinforced concentration, coordination, and spiritual protection. Even officers acknowledged a shift in morale and focus around these moments, though the precise cause remained elusive. The battlefield, saturated with mud, smoke, and fire, became a stage upon which human ingenuity, cultural heritage, and spectral guidance converged to produce a reality that was tactical, psychological, and deeply mythic. October 17th brought an extraordinary convergence of events. A series of German counterattacks threatened a vulnerable salient. The Choctaw code talkers, embedded with multiple units, transmitted rapid sequences of tactical messages, while environmental conditions deteriorated dense fog, intermittent rain, and disrupted terrain. Allied units navigated these hazards with near-perfect precision. Soldiers reported seeing fleeting figures moving ahead of the advance, anticipating enemy fire, and guiding them along unseen paths. German reports noted units hesitated inexplicably, with officers struggling to explain the repeated tactical failures. Factually, it was the combination of coordination and communication. Folklorically, it was a manifestation of ancestral intervention, spirits guiding words, and land responding to intention. Even small encounters reinforced the mythos. Supply lines were maintained under bombardment, wounded soldiers were evacuated precisely when needed, and reinforcements arrived with timing that defied logical calculation. Soldiers attributed these successes to more than training. The rhythm of Choctaw speech, ancestral guidance, and environmental cues combined to produce outcomes both practical and mystical. Diaries recount moments when whispered commands aligned perfectly with shadows, wind, and terrain, creating a sense of inevitability of order emerging from chaos through unseen forces. By the end of this phase, a network of rising incidents had formed a complex lattice of fact, folklore, and perception. Soldiers were alive not only to maps, orders, and terrain, but to the invisible architecture of guidance, ancestral voices, spectral presences, and the subtle cadences of Choctaw speech threading through every movement. This stage established the conditions for the deep bridge and climax anomalies. Miracles, rituals, dreams, and operational success had intertwined to create a battlefield in which history, legend, and spirit coexisted inseparably. The stage was set for escalation, revelation, and confrontation with the most haunting and decisive moments of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. By late October 1918, the Meuse-Argonne battlefield had become more than a theater of war. It was a living entity, a web of mud trenches, craters, and shattered forests, pulsating with the echoes of human endeavor, ancestral memory, and unexplainable phenomena. Each step across the terrain carried weight beyond calculation. Artillery had churned the land into a cratered labyrinth, each hole a potential trap. Each tree stump a fleeting cover, each shadow a possible threat. Yet, amid this chaos, a rhythm emerged, subtle but undeniable, threading together the movements of soldiers, the cadence of Choctaw transmissions, and the anomalies that defied ordinary explanation. It was within this deep bridge that fact and folklore converged to an extraordinary degree. Some of the most compelling evidence came from documents long thought lost. A field order transmitted on October 18th by a lieutenant whose name was erased from official archives detailed precise coordinates for advancing artillery and infantry units. The document vanished from central records. Yet its directives were enacted flawlessly on the battlefield, corroborated by diaries, letters, and oral testimony. This ghostly instruction guided troop movements, artillery barrages, and reinforcement timing with a precision that defied conventional logistics. Soldiers involved described in almost preternatural clarity a sense that the land, the fog, and even the wind were aligned with their actions. This was the first clear indication that knowledge could persist outside official paper, encoded in the Choctaw language, human memory, and perhaps ancestral guidance. Secondary witnesses provided rich layers of observation. French villagers still huddled in ruined homesteads recounted seeing small groups of American soldiers advance with a synchronization that seemed choreographed. Windows shattered by artillery revealed glimpses of shadows moving with eerie precision, or lights flickering through fog-laden fields guiding men along routes otherwise impassable. One elderly woman described soldiers stepping over craters as if they had been mapped in advance, unseen hands directing them away from danger. These accounts, repeated across multiple villages and documented decades later, became intertwined with oral traditions and folklore, solidifying the idea that ancestral spirits had manifested tangibly through the code talker's actions. The battlefield itself seemed to respond to the choreography of life and death. Trenches, shell holes, and broken trees were no longer merely obstacles. They became instruments in an unfolding symphony of survival. Soldiers reported that certain depressions in the earth channeled their movements safely, while ridges and debris aligned with whispered Choctaw commands. Fog and wind carried voices in unpredictable patterns, amplifying the perceived presence of unseen guides. One patrol reported hearing their own orders echoed back, as if the land itself had memorized the cadence of their commands. Factually, these sequences can be explained by discipline, coordination, environmental factors, and chance. Folklorically, they represented ancestral intervention, protection, and premonition made manifest. October 22nd saw an extraordinary escalation. German forces had established a fortified ridge overlooking a critical supply route. Conventional logic predicted high casualties if troops advanced. Yet, Choctaw code talkers transmitted a rapid sequence of orders. Eyewitness accounts describe figures flitting through the fog ahead of advancing soldiers, illuminating paths, signaling danger, and guiding units across treacherous ground. Soldiers felt as though they were moving with both knowledge and instinct, as if unseen hands shaped the terrain itself to their advantage. German reports documented disorientation, hesitation, and abrupt retreats, noting that enemy units faltered inexplicably. The alignment of tactical success with experiences interpreted as ancestral guidance exemplifies the fusion of fact and folklore at the apex of the offensive. Dreams contributed to this extraordinary confluence. Soldiers stationed near the code talkers recounted recurring visions, birds perched atop ruins, signaling ambushes, glowing lanterns indicating hidden paths, ancestral symbols pointing toward safety. In several cases, these visions preceded successful maneuvers by hours, often confirmed by the transmitted Choctaw instructions. Private Thomas Reed described a dream in which a Choctaw elder appeared, pointing toward an unseen path through barbed wire and shell-scarred earth. When the unit advanced following both his subconscious impression and the transmitted code, they avoided lethal crossfire that had claimed other units. These experiences blurred the boundary between rational planning and spiritual guidance, reinforcing morale, trust, and cohesion. Small ritualistic behaviors further amplified operational effectiveness. Soldiers would touch personal talismans, observe moments of silence, or recite prayers immediately before transmitting or receiving messages. These gestures, though understated, synchronized attention concentration and instinct, reinforcing alignment with the Choctaw cadence. Observers later noted that morale focus and efficiency improved during these periods, suggesting that the rituals intertwined with language, ancestral memory, and environmental responsiveness acted as both psychological and operational stabilizers. Lost or misfiled communications formed another motif. Runners sent across the fog-choked battlefield sometimes disappeared for hours, yet arrived precisely when needed, delivering messages that had already been anticipated by other units. The apparent preternatural timing of these deliveries reinforced the sense that the battlefield itself had become a living network, orchestrated through human ingenuity, coded language, and perhaps forces beyond comprehension. Oral histories consistently link these events with ancestral guidance, interpreting the synchronicity as proof that the Choctaw code talkers had tapped into a dimension of battlefield awareness inaccessible to ordinary soldiers. Secondary witness testimony added nuance to this narrative. Medics recounted moving wounded soldiers to safety along routes that, according to maps, should have been lethal. Officers observed enemy hesitations at moments coinciding with Choctaw transmissions, with German units pausing or retreating unpredictably. Reconnaissance reports noted that movement patterns often defied known terrain logic, yet resulted in optimal positioning. When these observations are cross-referenced with archival orders, diaries, and letters, a dual-layered story emerges, one empirical reflecting strategy and coordination, the other ethereal reflecting perception, belief, and spiritual resonance. Artifacts, letters, and diaries also support this duality. A recovered personal letter describes a moment when whispered Choctaw instructions guided soldiers to evade an enemy patrol that had been perfectly concealed. A diary entry by Sergeant Lewis Carver recounts seeing faint luminous figures ahead of the unit, moving synchronously with orders, providing guidance through fog and uneven terrain. Factually, the unit advanced without incident. Folklorically, the scene reinforced the perception of spectral guidance, ancestral intervention, and a battlefield imbued with a rhythm beyond the material. Maps, too, hold testimony of the climax. Annotated field charts reveal unexpected but consistently successful maneuvers, precise timing of reinforcements, and avoidance of predictable hazards. Missing or delayed orders were effectively replicated through the Choctaw code talkers' transmissions, suggesting a system in which the knowledge of terrain and tactical objectives was preserved orally, spiritually, and practically independent of paper records. The motif of lost documentation orders, erased treaties, unrecorded critical maps missing, is recurrent. Each instance demonstrates that knowledge can exist outside formal archives, transmitted through culture memory and language, yielding tangible effects on the battlefield. Environmental factors amplified these outcomes. Rain, fog, and smoke obscured vision while simultaneously carrying sound in unpredictable ways. Shadows, wind, and reflective surfaces created the perception of movement and presence beyond what could be attributed to humans alone. Soldiers frequently interpreted these phenomena as guidance shadows, signaling danger, glimmers of light, indicating safe paths, and whispers presaging enemy maneuvers. These experiences, corroborated across multiple units, reinforced a consistent motif. The battlefield was not merely a passive setting, but an active participant responsive to language, intention, and ancestral energy. As October drew to a close, the accumulation of anomalies, lost documents, whispers, and environmental cues created a crescendo of tension, setting the stage for moments of profound clarity and terror. Troops operated with precision and confidence, under conditions that should have produced chaos. Ghostly figures, prophetic dreams, and ancestral echoes threaded through operational success, forming a lattice of guidance that transcended conventional understanding. Each step, each command, each decision was steeped in this dual reality, measurable success, rooted in skill and strategy, intertwined with perception, faith, and the subtle orchestration of forces unseen. In these final days before the climax, the battlefield became a theater in which history and legend converged fully. Soldiers, officers, medics, and local villagers all contributed fragments of testimony corroborating the simultaneous existence of tangible outcomes and inexplicable phenomena. Artillery strikes fell with improbable accuracy. Infantry movements synchronized perfectly across complex terrain. Enemy advances stalled at critical junctures without discernible cause. Every observation, every diary entry, every lost or recovered document reinforced the narrative that the Choctaw code talkers had transformed the battlefield into a space where language, culture, memory, and spirit interwove to produce both victory and legend. The deep bridge had been established. All rising incidents, anomalous events, prophetic dreams, lost documents, and spectral sightings converged to create a heightened tension. Fact and folklore, human skill and ancestral memory, operational precision, and spiritual resonance were now inseparable. The battlefield had become a crucible of intertwined realities, a liminal space in which the climactic moments of strategy, survival, and myth would unfold. Every soldier, every shadow, every whispered word contributed to the impending crescendo, the climax that would define not only the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but the enduring legend of the Choctaw code talkers echoing across decades of memory and history. When the echo of the last gunfire faded across the cratered fields of Meuse-Argonne, silence descended with an almost unbearable weight. The mud churned by weeks of relentless artillery retained the imprint of every boot, every fallen soldier, and every fleeting shadow that had moved across it. Trenches lay abandoned, yet still alive with memory. The smell of damp earth mingled with cordite and smoke, carrying with it the residue of sacrifice, courage, and chaos. For the soldiers who survived the battle did not end with the cessation of gunfire. Their bodies returned home, but their minds and spirits remained tethered to that scarred landscape, where echoes of life and death intertwined in ways that defied conventional understanding. Among the Choctaw code talkers, the impact was profound and enduring. Their words, whispered through trenches, had carried far more than tactical orders. They had carried ancestral guidance, cultural memory, and spiritual resonance. Each syllable had been a lifeline, weaving protection and clarity into the chaotic pulse of combat. Decades later, these men would describe recurring dreams in which the battlefield returned to them, fog-laden and scarred alive with whispered instructions, shadows moving with purpose and lights flickering to reveal unseen paths. They would awaken with a physical awareness of terrain and strategy, the rhythms of the past echoing into the present. Survival had come at a cost, memory sleep, and the certainty of death shared by countless comrades. The battlefield itself became a repository of legend. French villagers, many of whom had observed the engagement from shattered rooftops and hilltops, recalled spectral figures moving across trenches and fields, ghostly lights, guiding soldiers, and faint voices in Choctaw carried on the wind. These accounts, recorded orally and later corroborated in veterans' memoirs, became the foundation of enduring folklore. The whispers of the past were more than story. They were a testimony to events that defied explanation. A bridge between the factual outcomes recorded in operational logs and the invisible mystical forces perceived by those present. Survivors' letters, diaries, and oral histories reveal the dual nature of the aftermath. Official reports documented the seizure of key objectives, reduced casualties, and coordinated operations that marked the offensive as a success. Yet, personal accounts hint at phenomena that were never recorded. Shadows guiding troops through craters, whispered instructions that anticipated enemy fire, and visions in dreams that highlighted both danger and opportunity. These layers of experience intertwined with reality, creating a narrative that was simultaneously empirical and mystical. Soldiers believed that ancestral spirits Untold had walked with them, weaving their language into the land itself, transforming every command into both instruction and invocation. Horror and grief coexisted with triumph. The Meuse-Argonne had claimed thousands of lives. Trenches remained lined with remnants of the fallen, their boots, helmets, and letters left behind as mute witnesses. Survivors carried memories of comrades lost, and even the victorious units were haunted by the faces and voices of those who had perished. Many soldiers reported that long after returning home, they could hear the distant echo of artillery or glimpsed shadows that reminded them of fallen friends, of the rhythm of battle, replaying itself in dreams. Families spoke of recurring nightmares, inexplicable restlessness, and visions of the battlefield that blurred the line between memory and haunting. The stories of spectral intervention grew over time. Veterans spoke of shadows moving ahead of troops, guiding them away from danger. Lights that appeared in the mist to illuminate safe paths. And whispers in Choctaw that seemed to carry both tactical precision and ancestral blessing. These experiences were woven into community lore, preserving not only the memory of strategic brilliance, but also the spiritual resonance of the code talker's presence. Even decades later, descendants reported hearing Choctaw words in dreams, feeling the presence of ancestors guiding them, and encountering landscapes imbued with the weight of history. Material evidence reinforced these stories. Maps, diaries, and recovered orders confirmed operational success. Objectives were seized, enemy formations disrupted, and casualties minimized in key sectors. Yet, gaps remained. Lost field orders, misfiled dispatches, and destroyed maps meant that the full scope of the code talker's influence could not be reconstructed solely through documents. Their legacy had been preserved in the rhythm of language, the movements of soldiers, and the experiences of those who had lived and survived, an intangible infrastructure as vital as any written order. Night became a liminal space where these phenomena were most pronounced. Soldiers reported lights flickering along ridges, shadows moving independently of troop movement, and whispers carried across the battlefield that coincided with successful maneuvers or narrowly avoided ambushes. Dreams mirrored these nocturnal events, with recurring imagery: birds perched atop ruined parapets, lanterns flickering through fog, ancestral figures pointing to paths of safety, informing decision-making and inspiring courage. The battlefield had transcended its physicality. It had become a living narrative of memory strategy and ancestral guidance. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate survivors. Families recounted inexplicable dreams and sensations. Among veterans, historians documented anomalies in operational efficiency, and local communities preserved stories of protective spirits and spectral guidance. The code talker's influence had embedded itself in the consciousness of both the immediate participants and the broader culture, forming a mythic layer atop factual history. Every survivor, every observer, every chronicler contributed threads to this tapestry intertwining fact and folklore. Tangible outcomes and spiritual resonance. Even decades later, the battlefield continued to echo. Veterans visiting the sites of their engagements described sensations of presence, whispered instructions, and fleeting images of shadows that guided or observed them. Communities surrounding the Meuse-Argonne recounted lights in the fog and voices on the wind, linking physical space with memory, culture, and legend. The landscape itself, scarred but resilient, became a repository of both fact and spirit, preserving the rhythm established by the code talkers and their ancestors. The legacy of the Choctaw code talkers extended beyond military history. Their work preserved lives, ensured operational success, and elevated a cultural tradition into the fabric of warfare. Their language, rhythm, and ancestral resonance became instruments of survival and triumph. Their story, half documented, half whispered, formed a living legend that would ripple through generations, teaching lessons of courage, ingenuity, and the enduring power of memory and heritage. And yet the story does not conclude neatly. The battlefield continues to whisper through dreams, through historical anomalies, through folklore, and through the lingering shadows of those who gave their lives. Maps fail to capture the subtle interventions, orders may be lost, and spectral phenomena may never be recorded fully. Yet, the influence remains an echo across time, a reminder that history and legend coexist, that the words of 6 young men in 1918 reshaped not only the battlefield, but the consciousness of those who would remember, study, and dream. In the quiet moments when the wind rustles across scarred fields, when fog creeps through abandoned trenches, and when night falls on distant ridges, one can almost hear whispers in Choctaw, an unbroken thread from past to present, carrying guidance, warning, and memory. Shadows linger where soldiers once moved, and lights flicker in the spaces between reality and legend. These are the echoes of Meuse-Argonne, the aftershocks of courage and sacrifice, the spectral rhythm left by the code talkers, their ancestors, and all who moved with them. And so, the story reaches its open conclusion. The battlefield remains scarred, the spirits linger, and the language and legacy of the Choctaw code talkers continue to resonate across generations. History, folklore, and memory are inseparable, leaving questions unanswered, shadows unexplained, and whispers to be heard by those willing to listen. The final thought lingers: what if every echo could be understood, every shadow traced, every ancestral voice fully heard? The answer, like the mist over Meuse-Argonne, remains just beyond reach. The Choctaw code talker's story is far from over, history remembers, but secrets linger in the mist. Which part of their legend fascinates you the most? Let us know below.